What's going on, everybody? All right, here we are on our Monday. This is the day where I review all of your responses to my question to each of you last week. Now, last week, we had a lot going on. We were talking about who are the guys that will remain hobby relevant indefinitely. Then we had the live stream and we talked about your responses on Tuesday night. And then my follow-up question, my question last Monday for this week was basically, does that affect how you collect? If you think that Mantle and Mays and Aaron and Ruth and Cobb and whoever was on your list are the guys that will remain hobby relevant, does that change who you do and don't collect? For example, are you going to go out and be collecting a bunch of, and the example I think that I used was Luis Aparicio. Are you going to go out and buy a bunch of Aparicio cards if you don't think that he's going to be hobby relevant down the road? Now, for some of us, the answer is, of course. And for some of us, the answer is, well, no. And as always, there's not right or wrong answers with this. It's just opinions. I find it really interesting. What are the things, what are the components that make up what we purchase, when we purchase it, and what things are going on in our mind to help make those decisions? And for some of us, it's all about the players that we like. It's all about the team that we collect. It's all about the guy that we grew up idolizing, whatever it is. And for some of us, it's, well, I want guys that are also going to go up in value. To a certain extent, it kind of feels at times like maybe it's a little bit taboo for somebody to say, well, yeah, I want my cards to go up in value. I want my cards, I want to buy stuff that I think is going to go up. And if I think that this player's popularity will remain, it's more likely that their cards will go up in value. It feels like that's almost like you're not supposed to say that. And does that make you not as much of a collector? You know, I hear the term sometimes, what is a true collector? You're a true collector if you collect just for the joy of collecting and you don't care about, the values and things like that. Well, I don't know what is or isn't a true collector. That's for somebody else to decide. All I know is I like collecting cards, and I think most of you do as well. And so I thought I'd put it out there of basically the sustainability of the name, the longevity of the name. How might that affect who you do buy, who you don't buy? Are you going to go out and buy a $1,000 card if it's of a player that people may not know of in 40 years? Well, some say yes and some say no. And there were responses, and there was one absolutely overwhelming response. And that's where I want to start right here. Now, a lot of people said, heck no, I don't care at all. My buddy Dan at Dan's Vintage Baseball PC says, as to this week's question, who will be forgotten or not forgotten is absolutely and completely irrelevant to my hobby pursuits. My collection is unique to me, and my choices of cards are related to who I believe is historically significant. So I have plenty of obscure players in my collection, particularly pre-war. And some of what I find fascinating is learning more about the history of baseball by uncovering the stories of those forgotten players. This next one says, thanks for pulling this together. I made a list, then started wrestling with it, so I never posted it. He goes on to say, to answer your question in this video, no. I collect people or characters I watch or admire. They are relevant to me. Each collector should focus on their targets. And another says, hi Greg, it was fun to see the results from your question. For this week's question, I collect Nolan Ryan mainly, and some other Hall of Famers. I collect the players that I enjoy collecting. I do not worry about whether or not the player is remembered. I enjoyed watching this one. It was fun. And finally, another says, as for this week's question, as long as I remember the player or what he stood for and enjoy collecting him, that's all that matters to me. A wise man once said, collect what you like, it's just a hobby. I mean, that was just a very small taste of the overwhelming avalanche of responses that were in that same line of thinking. So many people responded, and most, not all, but most said, no, I could not give a rat's rear end about whether or not a guy is going to be popular. I buy cards that I like. Maybe it's the look of the card. Maybe it's the set. Maybe it's the design. Maybe it's the image. Maybe it's the player. Maybe it's the team. But many, many, many people said it does not matter. And I do respect that. But I also wonder, and this is just a hypothetical, I think that this is probably not a fair sample. Right? It's probably not a fair sample for me to ask Midlife Nation, what do you all think? Because for the most part, most of the people who watch this channel, interact with this channel, leave comments on this channel, submit pickups on this channel, are people who are really in this for the joy of collecting cards. And not just that, but I think most of the people who watch this channel, our budgets are somewhat similar. You know, maybe $50 a month, maybe 100, maybe 150, maybe 200, maybe 20, somewhere between $200 and $20 from the high to the low is probably what most people watching this right now, what your monthly card budget is. And if that's what your monthly card budget is, that might affect it as well. Because it's like, well, yeah, I mean, I think we'd all like to have a Babe Ruth card. But if my budget is $30 a month, nah, aren't a lot of Babe Ruth cards on the horizon for me, right? So I totally get that too. So it's probably a very skewed sample to ask, and that's okay. That is okay. It's all about the perspectives of the people watching and interacting. And some of us might be totally on board and some of us might not. And some of us might be more interested about long-term values and some of us might not. You know, to a certain extent, that's one of the things I've said with grading is a lot of people go, why would you ever grade? Who needs to grade your cards? Why would you get cards graded? That's less money to spend on cards and you're spending money on plastic instead. Well, one of the things about grading cards is what it does is whoever ends up with your collection when you're gone has a better idea of what it is. It's easier to research the values and the condition for a novice if the card is already slabbed. And so a lot of people who are concerned about values, concerned about passing down their collection, they want to get cards slabbed so that it just makes that whole transaction easier. It's also easier to sell stuff, you know, electronically through different forums and different, you know, whether it be like a Facebook or whether it be an Instagram or eBay or an auction house even, when the card is already graded. Does that mean we should all get cards graded? Not necessarily. But again, those are all things that I think that people think about. So I totally get why so many people said, no, it doesn't matter. I mean, you're talking to a guy who PCs 3 players, right? Roger Clemens, who's one of the most hated players by a lot of people from my generation. Greg Nettles, who a lot of people have never heard of. And Matt Manning, who most people have never heard of. So you're talking to a guy who collects, who by far has more cards of those 3 players than of any player in my collection by just hundreds. So I do understand that perspective. And I respect that perspective. And I am aligned with that in many ways. But I gotta admit, there are times that value does matter and potential value matters. And if I'm going to be spending all of this money, it would be nice if I could at least get a lot of that money back someday. Like when I go to the movies, and I spend, you know, me and my wife go to the movies or something, we spend $40. as soon as I walk out of the theater, I have a memory left, that's cool, but I don't have anything tangible, right? I don't have anything tangible. But if I buy a painting of a famous artist and I hang it on the wall, then I get to enjoy that, right? And if I decided I wanted to sell it, I could get at least a lot of my money back. Maybe all of it, maybe more. So some things are experiences, and the experience is what we paid for. And some things are experiences with the tangibility and resale of them. So those are things that I think matter to a lot of us. So let's take a look at a couple of the responses that said, well, yeah, who the player is, it does matter. And let's take a look at that and why it matters. Let's check those out here. Now, some people said yes, in some instances, it does matter. My friend Tony, Southern Collector 14, says, I can't wait for the live stream. The answer to this week's question is the following. The question of hobby relevance affects my collecting in some ways, but not others. For example, I have a signed player run of Larry Doby because of the respect I have for the achievements to our society in baseball. I also have a collection of Stan Musial. Neither of those are on any of the lists for tomorrow night. I do feel the need to buy certain players that are on the list now before the prices go up more. I'm 55 and have 10 to 15 more years to collect before I cash out. I want the cards I collect to gain value for my family one day. That is one way I justify spending big bucks on the big money players. I know they won't make the same return as my IRA, but I hope that they gain a little more than inflation and don't lose money. This next one says, quite frankly, I could not care less about who's going to be popular in 20 years. I buy the cards I want of players on my list. Many of them have been forgotten as they're not in the Hall of Fame, which I love, keeps prices lower. But sure, I'd love to have more Mickey Mantles, but I also want more Ted Klaczewskis. If I was worried about just investing, then yes, I'd focus on the ultra-popular players named in today's video. All right, so, a couple of responses there are basically saying, well, yeah, to a certain extent, if I consider the money that I'm spending at least somewhat as an investment, then it does kind of matter what happens to the values. And to a certain extent, sort of like what Tony said in the first comment, he said, if I'm going to spend big bucks on a card, I can kind of justify doing that if I think that I can at least get my money back, potentially more money back down the road. Now, if you're a collector who shows up to a card show with $20 and your monthly budget is $20, it probably matters a lot less to you if your cards go up in value or not, because we're talking about $20, especially if you have a high net worth. And it's just a little side hobby. You go, oh, that card brings me nostalgia. I want to add that card. Oh, Ricky Henderson just passed away. I want to get a couple of Ricky Henderson cards because I liked him as a kid. But when you start talking about buying like a Babe Ruth or a Joe Jackson or a Satchel Paige or something like that, some significant money, you care a little bit more, like as in a lot more, what's going to happen with the value. Now, I've been to cards, just look at the National. So at the National last year, right, I showed up with a decent amount of money. And the first card that I bought was a $100 M101 Roger Peckinpah card. And I was just like, and don't get me wrong, a $100 card is not a cheap card. But I had a fair amount of money with me, and $100 was a very small percentage of the budget that I brought with me. And I saw it, and I was like, man, that's a cool looking card. Yankee Captain. I collect Yankee Captains. This could be another card for my Roger Peckinpah collection, my Yankee Captain collection. It's a good looking card. It's an important set. That has some huge cards in that set. I could add this card to my collection. Like, yeah, it checks a lot of boxes. It's $100, no problem. And I didn't really look it over that closely. It was graded and it's nice, but I didn't like get all, wound up about it being just right. And when I showed up at the National, I had two main targets. One was a T206 portrait of Cy Young. And one was, there were a couple of the different T206 Ty Cobb cards that I had on my list. One was the red portrait, and one was one of his action cards. And I'm sort of like, as I was looking through those cards, we're talking about like $2,000 to $4,000 for the card. We're not talking about a $100 Roger Peckinpah card anymore. We're talking about $2,000 to $4,000. We're talking about like half of my budget for the year, right? Or more. When I'm looking at a card like that, I am definitely thinking about, well, what's the escape clause look like? What's the escape hatch? If I hit the eject button on this card in 6 months, am I going to be okay? Would somebody down the road also want this card? Now, if the card has a crease through its face, if it has the corners snipped off, if it has, 99-1 centering or it's miscut, it might be harder to sell. And when I'm spending that kind of money, and I'm just speaking for me, I'm not trying to put words in anyone else's mouth, but if I'm just being honest, speaking for myself, if I'm spending that kind of money, it's got to be just right. It's got to be just right because I want to enjoy the thing that I spent that much money on. And then also I'm thinking, what's my escape clause? See, if I'm going to put a lot of money into something, I want it to be liquid. What do I mean by that? Something that is liquid is really easy to get money out from. There are certain cards I would like to have, an M101 Roger Peckinpah card. I like to have. A lot of people have no interest in that card. So if I put that card up for eBay right now, it might get 5 to 10 views in the first weekend. But if I put up a red portrait Ty Cobb that was really nicely centered with good color and registration up on eBay right now, I think in the first weekend, it would probably get 100 looks, 100 views, 25 watchers. There's way more demand for that. So what am I saying? What I'm saying is, to some of us, when we're spending this kind of money, when we're spending a higher amount of money on something, it kind of becomes an investment. Now, is it for everyone? No, people in different stratospheres financially, they'll look at a $1,000 card like I look at a $10 card. And so for them, they just go, oh yeah, that's cool. Take one of those or take one of those. But when we are spending a larger percentage of our card budget and or our income on a card, I think it's kind of natural to go, if I decided I didn't want this, could I get my money out? My buddy Tony, he uses the example of a bass boat. If he goes down and buys a brand new bass boat, right? If he goes down and buys a brand new bass boat and decides in a month I shouldn't have bought the boat, and he goes to sell it, he's going to get like 50% of his money back. Well, about 7 or 8 years ago, the midlife household said it'd be cool to have a boat. So we went out and we found a really nice used boat, and it was about $4,500. And we used it for about 3 years, and great memories with the kids running around on the lakes out here in Northern California, and, do water skiing and tubing and all this stuff. And then it got to where we weren't using it enough to justify the costs of insurance and stuff. We turned around and ended up selling it for over $5,000. So we made money on it. If I had bought a new boat, I wouldn't have made any money. I would have lost money 100%. But because I bought a nice used boat in good condition that other people would want, I knew that if I ever wanted to get rid of it, I could easily get rid of it, and I could easily get rid of it for at least what I paid for it. So I think these are things that naturally a lot of us think about when you start spending larger amounts of money. Now, am I saying everyone feels that way? Of course I'm not saying that. I'm never saying what other people should think. I'm sharing what I think. When I see somebody say, well, yeah, I care about, the relevance of the player because I'm spending a lot of money, and in 15 years or so, I'm going to probably want to liquidate, and I hope that they at least hold their value. It's a lot more likely that, a Babe Ruth is going to hold its value than a Drake May, right? I mean, can we agree on that? A CJ Stroud. It's much more likely the Babe Ruth, you're going to get a lot of your money back. Now, does that mean that the CJ Stroud won't be worth more? It could be worth 10 times more, but it could be worth 10 times the amount that it's worth right now. So I think that those things matter. And I think the other thing to consider is imagine for a second that I'm Jeff Wilson and my channel is Sports Card Investor. And I asked that same question. I asked the same question. Does the player on the card matter in what you're collecting? In what you're buying at this next card show, everybody? How much does it matter who's on the card? And I think the Sports Card Investor channel responses would be much different than the fact that 95% of the responses I got were, it doesn't matter at all, Greg. It could not matter any less. Heck no. I don't think it'd be the same responses. And I think the reason it wouldn't be the same responses is because of A, potentially the amount of money we're talking about, but B, if you're looking at a card that you're going to buy and hold long term, instead of buy and immediately try to sell somewhere else, like is what a lot of the sports card investing channel is. If you watch that channel, a lot of the cards, I was watching his channel the other day, and there was a card that he was selling at a card show that he was talking about that he had bought an hour earlier. He literally owned the card for an hour. I would be willing to bet most people watching this on their screen right now hold most of their cards for more than an hour. So I think the perspective is different. I respect no matter what people do, but I also certainly think that the amount of money that you're putting into the hobby probably has something to do with how important it is that the player is relevant in 20 years or when you may want to get out and hit the escape clause. Just my thoughts. Couple more responses I wanted to share. Let's take a look at those here. This last category says, well, sorta, but I already collect all-timers. This first one says, Greg, interesting video and an interesting question as well. I think that I had already changed how I collect because of this. I had already stopped trying to collect complete sets and spending money on non-Hall of Fame players. I had started just buying the Hall of Fame players in any given set. I now find myself looking for Aaron, Clemente, Mantle, and Mays mostly. I only buy other players if there is some additional connection, such as from my state or played for my team. And finally, this one says, where have you gone, Joe DiMaggio? America cries for you. Mr. Midlife, I collect what I want, period. Don't care about any list or graded cards. I started collecting cards in 1970 as a 10-year-old. At that time, everyone wanted Hank Aaron cards. Now, most collectors don't value Aaron as they should, but that's okay with me. I get better Aaron cards at a lower cost. And I love my 1966 Topps Batman cards. That is pure art on cardboard. Thanks for your Wise Man videos. I watch every one. All right, now part of it is like the comment about the Hank Aaron collector, right? It's like my good friend Orlando of A Collector's Dream. He was a Mickey Mantle guy, and he has a Mickey Mantle run, and he has some incredible Mickey Mantle cards, and he's had a lot of cards, but a lot of his cards he's sold and moved into different things. But some of his big mantles he still has. And if you said to Orlando, does it matter to you if the cards have long-term, recognition of the player, and they're going to stay relevant long-term, and they're going to hold their value long-term? And if you're already a Mantle collector, it's just like, well, I don't really think about it, because you don't have to, because it's Mantle. Right? If you're a Hank Aaron collector, if you're a Willie Mays collector, if you're a Ty Cobb collector, if you're a Satchel Paige collector, a Jackie Robinson collector, a Babe Ruth collector, a Lou Gehrig collector, it's not something you really think about, because part of the guy that you're collecting already, you don't really have to worry about them staying relevant, because they're going to be relevant. But if you are a Al Kaline collector, right? If you're a Frank Robinson collector, if you're an Orlando Cepeda collector, or, a lot of guys, a Don Drysdale collector, if you're a collector of those sorts of players, it is something to at least consider before you spend big money. If you're going to spend big money on a card, doesn't it, and again, I'm not trying to speak for everyone. Please understand that I'm saying that. There are some people that will spend big money and they still could not care less about whether anyone else thinks that that card, that player, that set, that release is relevant at all. I get it. But for a lot of us, when we're spending a good amount of money, you never know what tomorrow will bring. You never know what tomorrow will bring. And because of that, it's probably something that at least should be a percentage of the equation, or could be a percentage of the equation of, if I had to get rid of my cards, could I sell them? And if you're collecting Dale Murphy cards, if you're collecting, and I don't want to start picking on guys, but Darrell Evans or Jim Rice, or hey, Harold Baines. That's for you, Jason. If you are a Harold Bain collector, before you spend $1,000 on some rare release, high grade, eye appeal Harold Baines card, it's probably something to consider. Now, I just think this stuff is fun to talk about. I don't think by any means, like I said in my video the other day, I'm not trying to tell people what they should and shouldn't do. I'm not trying to say you should only buy guys that are going to be long-term relevant. I'm not trying to say you should buy anything different than you're buying. But I am fascinated by what the ingredients are that go in for each collector that helps them decide where they're going to spend their hobby dollars. To me, that's fascinating. I love trying to understand how other people work, because as a result, it helps me to figure out how I work. And it's like therapy for me. And so you guys sharing what are the components that help you decide what to buy, when to buy it, how much to spend. I love hearing about it. I just think it's fascinating. And I have a question for this week that I'm also really interested in. Again, we just started the new year. We are closing in on the last week and a half or so of January. So we've kind of entered January. We've kind of gotten our bearings in 2025, and we've got 11 and a half months left. And I'm really curious about something. And this was a question that a few of you asked me a year ago. And the question is, if you were to look into your crystal ball, what do you think is the one prediction for the sports card market and the sports card industry for 2025? So 1 year from today, what is your prediction on what's going to happen over the next 12 months? It might be something with the companies. It might be something with the manufacturers, with the grading companies, with which players suddenly have more appeal, something with autographs, non-autographs, high grade, low grade, eye appeal. I don't know. But what's your prediction for 2025 with the sports card market? And I'm trying to leave it open-ended because I think that some of the responses could be really interesting. But look into that crystal ball, shake that magic 8 ball and look, and what do you see? Share it in the comments down below. I think it's a fun experience to kind of predict what might happen. I will say this, at the start of 2024, somebody said, what do you think is going to happen with the market, Greg? And I said, honestly, I don't think there's going to be anything moving way up. I don't think there's going to be anything moving way down. I don't think vintage or modern or anything is going to do anything dramatic because it's an election year. And in election years, people tend to kind of just ride things out. And there aren't usually any dramatic changes. And some people would look back on the last year and go, there were some dramatic changes. And I think with some of the companies and the consolidations and the partnerships, there were some fairly dramatic changes. But I don't feel like vintage cards went way up or way down. I don't feel like modern cards went way up or way down. I think things were just kind of like a fairly plateaued year. Let me know if I'm wrong about that, but your predictions for 2025, I look forward to them. Thanks for watching.